They were famous, admired, unavoidable, until they weren't. This isn't a story about talent lost, but about affection withdrawn. About stars who filled theaters and living rooms, only to find themselves mocked, mistrusted, or quietly pushed aside by the very country that made them. Some were too loud, some were too powerful. Some simply arrived at the wrong moment in history. Tonight, we're not asking who was right or wrong, we're asking a colder question. How does a nation decide when it's done loving you? And if you're drawn to stories like this, the uncomfortable ones that don't wrap themselves up neatly, take a second to subscribe. These long nights of forgotten reputations and unresolved questions only work if you keep coming back. And before we go any further, tell us something quietly human in the comments. Where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now. Some of these stories feel different depending on the hour. 1. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed entered British culture like a barroom door kicked off its hinges. He was enormous, physically, vocally, temperamentally, and for a while the industry mistook that enormity for inevitability. A force of nature, they said. You don't control weather systems, you endure them. But weather systems flood villages. And by the mid-1970s, many people in British film and television were done mopping up. Reed's talent was never in dispute. Even his harshest critics admitted that when the camera rolled and the chaos briefly aligned, he could do things other actors simply couldn't. He radiated danger, tenderness, menace, and absurdity sometimes in the same breath. The problem was that the breath often smelled like a pub at closing time. Productions learned to schedule around him, then learned that you can't schedule around someone who doesn't believe in schedules. Press hostility followed predictably. Interviews became traps. Chat show appearances became spectacles where the joke was no longer the host or the format, but the question of whether Reed would finish the episode upright. Tabloids loved him the way vultures love a limping animal, fondly, eagerly, with no intention of helping. Each incident made the next one easier to frame, until the story wrote itself and Reed became less an actor than a recurring public warning. Behind the scenes, the affection drained faster. Co-stars described fear, exhaustion, resentment. Insurers refused to cover him. Producers quietly stopped calling. Directors weighed the value of brilliance against the certainty of disruption and increasingly chose certainty. The industry didn't exile Reed in one dramatic gesture. It simply stopped making room for him. That's how reputations usually die, not with outrage, but with logistics. What made the hostility so enduring was Reed's refusal to perform repentance. He didn't apologize convincingly, didn't retreat into shame, didn't offer the public a redemption arc they could clap for. He doubled down. He laughed. He treated disapproval as proof of authenticity. That posture thrilled some audiences and infuriated everyone tasked with turning art into a functioning workplace. By the time later reassessments softened the narrative, brilliant but self-destructive, a victim of his appetites, the damage had long been done. Those are elegiac phrases, applied after the shouting stops. During his lifetime, the dominant emotion wasn't tragic admiration. It was weary hostility. And that hostility set a pattern British television knew all too well. The powerful man tolerated not because he was liked, but because removing him felt harder than enduring him. A pattern that, when followed far enough, doesn't just embarrass an industry, it exposes it. And no figure embodied that quieter, more unsettling endurance quite like the next name on this list. 2. Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile was never universally loved. That's the detail history sometimes blurs, but contemporaries did not. Even at his peak, when he was wrapped in tracksuits and catchphrases and an air of tireless benevolence, discomfort followed him like a shadow that refused to stay behind the camera. The hostility wasn't always loud. It was often muttered, joked about, filed under odd or best not to ask. Staff avoided being alone with him. Colleagues described him as aggressive, bullying, domineering. His on-screen persona, hyperactive, strangely intimate, vaguely threatening, didn't reassure everyone the way it was supposed to. For some viewers, he wasn't quirky, he was alarming, and they said so, sometimes publicly, often privately. Inside institutions, the resentment was sharper. Savile understood power structures instinctively and leaned into them with a grin. He cultivated authority figures, bypassed intermediaries, treated rules as inconveniences meant for other people. That behavior doesn't endear you to coworkers. It creates fear, silence, and eventually hostility, especially when complaints seem to evaporate on contact with hierarchy. The press played a complicated role. Certain journalists mocked him relentlessly, portraying him as grotesque or sinister long before anything could be formally articulated. Others pulled punches, sensing that something was wrong but lacking either proof or permission. The result was a strange cultural standoff. A man who was publicly celebrated and privately distrusted, simultaneously untouchable and deeply unpopular. What's crucial here is that the unease was not retrospective. Memoirs, interviews, internal accounts all point to the same thing. People felt something was off and reacted accordingly. They rolled their eyes. They avoided him. They complained. They warned each other. Hostility doesn't always look like protest. Sometimes it looks like quiet refusal to relax. After his death, confirmed revelations redefined his place in history completely. But they did not invent the discomfort. They explained it. They gave shape to something that had existed for decades without a name strong enough to stick. And once again, British television was forced to confront a familiar contradiction. A figure widely disliked, deeply distrusted, yet institutionally protected. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when that hostility doesn't come from whispers in corridors, but from audiences watching live, week after week, openly recoiling from the person in charge of the microphone? Before we go on, if these stories are landing with you, the pauses, the discomfort, the parts history prefers to skip, consider subscribing. This channel exists for listeners who like their nights a little quieter and their questions unanswered. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell us where you're listening from and what time it is right now. These stories tend to change depending on the hour. 3. Huey Green. Huey Green didn't unsettle audiences by accident. He did it deliberately, methodically, and often with a smile that suggested he enjoyed the recoil. As the host of Opportunity Knocks, he positioned himself not as a facilitator of dreams, but as their gatekeeper, and occasionally their executioner. Contestants feared him, not in the theatrical sense, but in the practical one. He interrupted, belittled, dismissed. His critiques weren't just sharp, they were personal. He wielded authority like a blunt instrument and seemed baffled that anyone would object. This was, after all, his show, his judgment, his stage. And if humiliation made good television, that was the price of opportunity. Audiences noticed. Complaints poured in. Satirists had a field day. Comedians caricatured him mercilessly, often barely exaggerating. Unlike other disliked figures, Green's hostility was visible and vocal. People wrote letters. They switched channels. They talked about him not as a lovable curmudgeon, but as a man who appeared to relish power over the vulnerable. Part of the resentment stemmed from his certainty. Green didn't just judge talent. He lectured on morality, politics, taste. He framed his opinions as objective truth and treated disagreement as ignorance. In an era when television was becoming more participatory, more democratic, Green felt like a holdover from something colder and more hierarchical. Behind the scenes, the reputation matched the screen presence. Colleagues described arrogance, inflexibility, and a startling lack of empathy. He wasn't misunderstood. He was accurately perceived, and that perception calcified into something rare in broadcasting. A presenter who continued to be successful while being openly disliked. Unlike others on this list, Green never received a major reputational rehabilitation. Time didn't soften him into a misunderstood traditionalist. It simply confirmed what audiences had felt all along. His legacy is less about talent discovered than about the discomfort of watching authority exercised without kindness. Which leaves us with an unsettling thread tying these figures together. Hostility doesn't always destroy careers. Sometimes it coexists with them, feeds them, even sustains them. And as British entertainment moved forward, that uneasy coexistence would take on new forms, some louder, some subtler, but none entirely unfamiliar. 4. Sid James. Sid James laughed his way into Britain's living rooms with a voice that sounded permanently mid-chuckle, a grin that suggested mischief without consequence. For a long time, audiences loved him for exactly that reason. He felt approachable, familiar, safely disreputable. But affection curdles quickly when the joke starts to feel tired, or worse, embarrassing. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, James became a lightning rod for a growing cultural irritation. Critics increasingly framed him not as a comic institution, but as a symptom of stagnation. The Carry On films, once cheeky and subversive, were now accused of laziness, smut, and creative decay. And James, as their most recognizable face, absorbed much of that resentment whether he deserved it individually or not. The hostility sharpened when he left Britain for tax reasons. In an era when entertainers were still expected to embody a kind of national loyalty, this was framed as betrayal. The press pounced. Moral campaigners weighed in. James was no longer just a comedian telling outdated jokes. He was a symbol of cultural decline and personal opportunism rolled into one wheezing laugh. What stung most, according to contemporaries, was the sense that he knew the tide had turned and couldn't or wouldn't fight it. Reviews grew harsher. Younger performers distanced themselves. Comedy itself was changing, becoming sharper, angrier, more political. James represented an older Britain that many critics were eager to move past, and they did so loudly. Yet audiences didn't abandon him overnight. That contradiction, popular with viewers, dismissed by tastemakers, kept him working even as the hostility mounted. It's a uniquely British cruelty to keep someone employed while publicly sneering at their relevance. James became both omnipresent and unfashionable, a familiar face increasingly treated as an artifact rather than an artist. Only later did nostalgia smooth the edges, recasting him as a beloved rogue rather than a national embarrassment. But during his final years, the dislike was real, persistent, and deeply personal. He wasn't hated for scandal or cruelty. He was disliked for overstaying his welcome in a country eager to redecorate. And if Sid James was resented for representing an old order that refused to leave quietly, the next figure on this list was disliked for enforcing that order with terrifying precision and brilliance. 5. Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier inspired awe the way storms do, from a safe distance. Up close, many found him intolerable. There was no serious debate about his talent. The hostility surrounding Olivier had nothing to do with incompetence. It was about power, and how unapologetically he used it. As an actor and director, Olivier ruled rehearsal rooms with an iron certainty. He demanded absolute commitment, emotional exposure, and unwavering obedience. For those who thrived under pressure, he was a master. For others, he was a tyrant. Accounts from colleagues describe an atmosphere of fear, where disapproval felt catastrophic and approval fleeting. Working with Olivier meant submitting to his vision, or being diminished by it. This reputation didn't stay behind closed doors. Memoirs leaked. Disputes became public. His marriage to Vivien Leigh, scrutinized relentlessly, added to the sense of emotional turbulence orbiting his professional life. The press framed him as grand, remote, domineering, a genius who expected the world to contort itself around his standards. What made the hostility complex was its coexistence with reverence. Institutions celebrated him while individuals resented him. He was knighted lauded, institutionalized as culture itself, even as actors whispered warnings to each other. That duality insulated him from consequences. Who challenges a monument while it's still being built? Yet resentment accumulated. Younger performers pushed back against his methods. Theater culture began shifting toward collaboration rather than command. Olivier, for all his adaptability on stage, struggled to relinquish authority off it. His certainty, once reassuring, began to feel suffocating. Later reassessments softened his image, emphasizing vulnerability and illness, reframing harshness as generational severity. But those who worked under him rarely mistook fear for inspiration. Respect, yes. Gratitude, sometimes. Affection, rarely. Olivier represents a particular kind of disliked figure. Not the scandal maker, not the embarrassment, but the brilliant ruler whose reign leaves emotional debris behind. And if his dominance came from certainty and command, the next man on this list wielded hostility differently, through bitterness, sarcasm, and a remarkable talent for making everyone else as unhappy as he felt. 6. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams sounded like laughter, but lived in irritation. On screen and on radio, his voice was unmistakable, nasal, precise, theatrically wounded. Off screen, that woundedness hardened into something sharper. Colleagues didn't just find him difficult, they braced for him. Williams was intensely intelligent, acutely self-aware, and profoundly dissatisfied. He believed he was underused, underappreciated, and surrounded by fools. That belief colored nearly every professional interaction. He complained constantly, insulted freely, and kept meticulous mental lists of perceived slights. Wit, when mixed with resentment, becomes a weapon, and Williams wielded it expertly. Within the Carry-On ensemble, tensions were well known. He mocked co-stars, undermined writers, and voiced disdain for the very material that sustained his fame. Producers tolerated him because he was reliable on camera, but off it, he was widely regarded as corrosive. The phrase, "impossible," followed him through casting offices with weary consistency. The public saw flashes of this bitterness in interviews, where snobbery and contempt slipped through the persona. While audiences laughed, insiders winced. Unlike others who masked hostility with charm, Williams broadcast his dissatisfaction. He seemed offended by success, irritated by affection, and suspicious of praise. His diaries, published later, confirmed what many had suspected. They revealed not a misunderstood eccentric, but a man locked in combat with his own expectations and everyone who failed to meet them, which was everyone. Sympathy grew, but so did clarity. His unhappiness wasn't imposed from outside. It radiated outward. Yet the tragedy of Williams is not that he was disliked, but that he anticipated it. He expected rejection, prepared for it, and often provoked it preemptively. Hostility became both shield and prophecy, and as British comedy moved toward figures whose personal demons spilled more destructively into their careers, Williams stands as a bridge between resentment quietly endured and resentment that would soon detonate publicly, taking careers with it. 7. Tony Hancock. Tony Hancock wanted to be taken seriously, more than he wanted to be liked, and British entertainment punished him for that ambition. At his peak, he was everywhere, voice, face, timing perfectly calibrated to a nation that recognized itself in his irritation. Hancock's half hour didn't just make people laugh, it made them feel seen. And that visibility fed Hancock's certainty that he was the engine, not a component. That belief fractured his working relationships. Writers Ray Galton and Alan Simpson were not just collaborators, they were architects. Hancock, however, increasingly treated them as replaceable. He bristled at criticism, dismissed advice, and chased prestige roles that would prove he was more than a comic voice behind a desk. The industry watched this with growing unease, because British comedy has little patience for performers who appear to resent their own audience. Alcohol didn't create the hostility around Hancock, but it amplified it. Rehearsals became unpredictable. Meetings grew tense. The press sensed instability and began circling. When he split from Galton and Simpson, it wasn't framed as artistic growth. It was framed as arrogance. And once the laughter faltered, the affection evaporated quickly. Audiences didn't revolt. They drifted. That quiet withdrawal was devastating. Hancock took it personally, publicly, repeatedly. Interviews grew defensive. Performances tightened. He seemed to be arguing with the country rather than entertaining it. British culture, fond of self-deprecation and allergic to ego, recoiled. By the time his career stalled, the hostility had solidified into a narrative. Wasted talent, difficult personality, cautionary tale. Colleagues spoke of brilliance shadowed by insecurity. Executives remembered headaches. The public remembered disappointment more than delight. Later reassessments softened the tone, reframing Hancock as tragic rather than contemptible. But during his decline, sympathy was scarce. He wasn't disliked for cruelty or scandal. He was disliked for wanting something the audience didn't want for him, and refusing to adjust when they said no. And if Hancock's downfall came from rejecting the mirror comedy held up to him, the next figure on this list became controversial for holding up a mirror the critics found crude, regressive, and impossible to defend with irony. 8. Benny Hill. Benny Hill's smile was familiar, relentless, and eventually unwelcome. For years, his fast motion chases and wordless routines traveled effortlessly across borders, turning him into one of Britain's most internationally recognized entertainers. Abroad, he was a curiosity. At home, he became a battleground. The hostility toward Hill wasn't sudden. It accumulated. Critics accused his work of being repetitive, lazy, and out of step with a society grappling with changing attitudes toward gender and power. What once passed as harmless nonsense was now framed as embarrassing, even corrosive. Hill, famously shy and private off-screen, offered little defense. He believed the work spoke for itself. By the late 1970s, many felt it spoke too loudly. Feminist groups condemned the show. Cultural commentators dismissed it as juvenile. Reviewers sharpened their knives. The irony that Hill himself lived quietly, gave generously, and avoided celebrity excess did soften the criticism. In public discourse, the persona swallowed the man whole. ITV's decision to cancel the Benny Hill show was not driven by ratings, which remained strong, but by discomfort. Hill became emblematic of a television era executives were eager to disown. The message was clear. Popularity was no longer protection. Being widely watched did not mean being welcome. Hill's reaction was muted. He withdrew, confused by a country that seemed suddenly ashamed of him. The hostility wasn't personal in tone, but it was absolute in outcome. He was no longer invited to evolve. He was simply removed. Later generations would rediscover him, often without the cultural baggage, laughing at the mechanics rather than the implications. Britain, however, remained conflicted. Hill became a symbol of something unresolved, how quickly a nation can turn on entertainment that once defined it. And that discomfort, between image and individual, between persona and person, would follow the next star even more mercilessly, amplified by tabloids eager to build a woman up precisely so they could tear her down. 9. Diana Dors. Diana Dors was Britain's problem long before she was Britain's scandal. Branded the English Marilyn Monroe, she was celebrated and resented in equal measure. A woman who understood publicity too well for a culture that preferred its stars grateful and contained. From the beginning, the hostility was gendered. Dors was accused of vulgarity, ambition, excess. She didn't simply act. She posed, provoked, and performed herself off-screen with the same intensity. The tabloids feasted. Every relationship, every expense, every reinvention was framed as evidence of moral failure rather than strategy. Serious roles suffered. Casting directors hesitated. Critics dismissed her before performances could be judged. When she faced financial difficulties and left Britain for tax reasons, the press sharpened its tone further. She was no longer just glamorous. She was irresponsible. No longer bold. She was tasteless. What made Dors particularly vulnerable was her refusal to play the repentant role. She leaned into spectacle, into camp, into visibility. British culture, which often punishes women for unapologetic self-promotion, responded with sustained hostility. She was mocked, sidelined, and reduced to headlines. Behind the caricature was a capable actress whose career narrowed under the weight of reputation. Opportunities shrank. Respect became conditional. By the time reassessments arrived, casting her as a victim of a brutal press culture, the damage was irreversible. Dors's story reveals how dislike can be manufactured, fed, and normalized until it feels inevitable. She wasn't hated for one act or one scandal. She was disliked for refusing to disappear quietly. And as British entertainment moved deeper into an era of moral anxiety and cultural policing, the next figure on this list would provoke hostility not through glamour or excess, but through genius paired with behavior that institutions increasingly refuse to ensure or tolerate. 10. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole looked like a romantic hero carved out of excess. Blue-eyed, lyrical, ferociously intelligent, he embodied a kind of doomed brilliance that British culture has always admired, from a distance. Up close, however, admiration curdled into frustration, and eventually, resentment. After Laurence of Arabia, O'Toole became untouchable in reputation and exhausting in practice. His commitment to performance was unquestioned, but his commitment to professionalism was inconsistent. Productions learned to brace themselves. Missed calls, erratic availability, and unpredictable behavior became part of the calculation. Studios didn't complain publicly at first. They quietly adjusted budgets and schedules. Then insurers began to refuse coverage, which is the industry's least poetic and most definitive form of disapproval. The press treated his excesses with a mixture of mockery and indulgence. At first it was charming, proof that genius refused to live by ordinary rules. But charm has a shelf life. By the 1970s, headlines hardened. O'Toole was no longer the wild poet of cinema. He was a liability. Colleagues admired him, but few trusted him. Reverence does not equal reliability. What complicated public perception was O'Toole's self-awareness. He spoke openly, often wryly, about his own destructiveness. This candor disarmed some critics and irritated others. Confession, after all, is not correction. British culture tolerates excess only when it feels accidental. O'Toole's felt theatrical. The hostility that surrounded him wasn't moralistic so much as operational. He made things difficult. He made things expensive. And in an industry that survives on controlled illusion, unpredictability is the ultimate sin. Later narratives would romanticize the chaos, reframing it as the price of brilliance. But during his career's most turbulent years, that romance didn't pay wages or calm crews. O'Toole remained admired, but increasingly at arm's length. A legend you booked cautiously, if at all. And if O'Toole's reputation suffered from living too loudly, the next figure on this list became controversial for speaking too loudly, often deliberately, often provocatively, and rarely with concern for who might be listening. 11. Spike Milligan. Spike Milligan's mind moved faster than manners, and Britain never quite decided whether to applaud or recoil. As a creative force, he was revolutionary. As a public figure, he was combustible. The hostility that followed him wasn't rooted in misunderstanding, it was rooted in impact. Milligan delighted in provocation. He challenged authority reflexively, mocked institutions gleefully, and treated public decorum as an obstacle rather than a boundary. For a time, this felt refreshing, a necessary antidote to post-war stiffness. But provocation ages quickly, especially when it repeats itself without reflection. Broadcasters grew wary. Politicians bristled. Sections of the press condemned him regularly. Each controversy fed the next, creating a loop in which Milligan's unpredictability became his brand and his burden. Unlike performers who apologize strategically, Milligan rarely softened his stance. He preferred escalation. What unsettled many wasn't just what he said, but how casually he dismissed the consequences. He seemed uninterested in persuasion, content instead with disruption. That posture thrilled fans who saw him as a truth-teller and infuriated critics who saw him as irresponsible. Mental health struggles, discussed more openly later, complicated reassessment. Sympathy emerged. Context deepened. But during his most controversial years, tolerance was thin. Broadcasters debated him not as an asset, but as a risk. Milligan occupies a strange space in British culture, celebrated innovator, persistent irritant. He forced laughter and discomfort into the same room and refused to separate them. That refusal earned him admiration and sustained hostility. And if Milligan challenged boundaries with words, the next figure on this list became a focal point of hostility simply by existing at the center of a moral panic she did not create and could not escape. 12. Mary Millington. Mary Millington did not provoke Britain so much as Britain projected its anxieties onto her. In the 1970s, as censorship tightened and moral debates intensified, Millington became a symbol, stripped of individuality and burdened with collective unease. The hostility she faced was relentless and impersonal. Newspapers framed her as a threat to decency. Campaigners treated her career as evidence of societal decay. Legal pressures mounted. Work vanished almost overnight. She was discussed endlessly, rarely listened to. What distinguished Millington's experience from others on this list was the absence of scandal in her personal conduct. She was not disruptive, arrogant, or combative. She was accessible, articulate, and by many accounts professional. None of that mattered. She represented something Britain wanted to suppress, and so she absorbed the backlash. Public shaming followed a familiar pattern: exaggeration, repetition, erasure. Her success became something to be corrected rather than celebrated. Opportunities closed, support thinned. The hostility wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. Only later did reassessment arrive, recasting her as a casualty of hypocrisy rather than its cause. But during her lifetime, sympathy was scarce and judgment abundant. Millington's story exposes a different mechanism of dislike, one driven not by behavior, but by fear. And as British culture continued to negotiate loyalty, respectability, and suspicion, the next figure on this list would find himself mistrusted not for excess or provocation, but for seeming insufficiently aligned with the nation's expectations. 13. James Mason. James Mason carried himself like a man permanently observing the room rather than belonging to it. His voice, measured, resonant, faintly disapproving, became his signature, but it also fed the suspicion that followed him through much of his career. Mason was admired, certainly, but admiration does not cancel distrust. In Britain, especially during the mid-20th century, aloofness was often mistaken for disloyalty. Early success established him as a serious dramatic actor, yet his refusal to conform to easy patriotism quickly complicated his reputation. During and after the Second World War, Mason's political views, or rather his refusal to shout them loudly enough, drew scrutiny. He was perceived as evasive, insufficiently aligned, too thoughtful when certainty was expected. The press noticed, so did the establishment. When Mason left Britain for tax reasons, the hostility hardened. This was a familiar narrative by then. The successful actor who took his talent elsewhere and was promptly reframed as ungrateful. Articles questioned his loyalty. Commentators painted him as cold, elitist, and detached from the country that had elevated him. Unlike more flamboyant figures, Mason didn't rebut these claims theatrically. He withdrew, which only reinforced the image. His demeanor didn't help. Mason was reserved, introspective, and often critical of celebrity culture. In an industry increasingly dependent on charm and accessibility, he offered neither readily. Interviews felt formal. He seemed uninterested in being liked. That disinterest was interpreted as contempt, and contempt is rarely forgiven. Yet the hostility was curiously restrained. Mason wasn't mocked relentlessly or publicly shamed. He was quietly mistrusted. Roles became complicated. British institutions hesitated. Hollywood proved more receptive, and his international success further fueled domestic resentment. Success abroad has always unsettled British cultural pride when it feels like abandonment. Later reassessments would be generous. Mason became a paragon of understated acting, a model of restraint in a loud profession. The earlier suspicions softened into footnotes. But during the height of his career, the discomfort was real. He was admired but not embraced, respected but kept at a distance. Mason's experience reveals a peculiarly British discomfort with those who refuse emotional transparency. And if his hostility came from quiet suspicion rather than noise, the next figure on this list invited noise deliberately, thriving on confrontation, provoking irritation, and wearing public dislike as proof of relevance. 14. Michael Winner. Michael Winner never wanted to be liked. He wanted to be heard, quoted, recognized, and feared, preferably in that order. A filmmaker and public personality of relentless certainty, Winner cultivated antagonism as a form of branding. The hostility that followed him was not accidental. It was cultivated. From his earliest appearances, Winner spoke with absolute authority on subjects he often treated with disdain. Critics, actors, journalists, no one was spared. He dismissed dissent as ignorance and disagreement as personal weakness. In interviews, he bulldozed conversation. On television, he leaned into excess, volume, and confrontation. Britain, which tolerates eccentricity but resents arrogance, responded predictably. His films, particularly the Death Wish series, intensified the backlash. Critics accused him of sensationalism, moral simplification, and provocation without reflection. Winner dismissed these critiques loudly, accusing reviewers of elitism and cowardice. Each exchange fed the cycle. He became less a director than a personality, a lightning rod who drew attention whether he released a film or not. Within the industry, resentment simmered. Actors described him as domineering. Crew members complained of bullying behavior. His reputation as difficult preceded him. Yet Winner seemed energized by this. Dislike confirmed his self-image as an outsider speaking uncomfortable truths, even as he enjoyed mainstream platforms. The press mocked him relentlessly, often gleefully. Parodies flourished. He was portrayed as bombastic, out of touch, and grotesquely self-assured. Unlike others on this list, Winner did not suffer quietly. He retaliated, escalating the hostility into a public performance. Over time, his provocations hardened into caricature. The conversation shifted from what he made to how he behaved. By the later years of his career, his work was almost secondary to his persona. He was invited not to create, but to argue. Winner's legacy remains divisive because he wanted it that way. He forced audiences to confront a question British culture rarely resolves comfortably. How much dislike is too much when someone refuses to be ashamed of it? And that question would take on a different, more uncomfortable shape with the next figure, whose hostility arose not from his own views, but from a character audiences could not separate from the man who played him. 15. Warren Mitchell. Warren Mitchell became the target of hostility by accident, and then by misunderstanding. As Alf Garnett in Till Death Us Do Part, Mitchell portrayed bigotry so vividly that satire blurred into discomfort. The character was designed to expose prejudice through exaggeration, but satire depends on the audience knowing where the joke ends. Many didn't. Viewers wrote letters praising Garnett's views, missing the point entirely. Others protested, appalled that such sentiments were broadcast at all. Mitchell found himself trapped between two hostile camps, those who embraced the character for the wrong reasons, and those who condemned the actor for giving him life. Nuance evaporated. Public abuse followed. Mitchell received threats and faced protests. In public spaces he was confronted not as an actor, but as Alf Garnett himself. The distinction he carefully maintained collapsed under audience projection. For a performer trained in classical and serious drama, this was professionally suffocating. The press struggled as well. Articles alternated between praising the show's bravery and condemning its existence. Mitchell's own political views, progressive, thoughtful, and opposed to the character's beliefs, were often ignored. The image was stronger than the explanation. Typecasting compounded the hostility. Casting directors hesitated to see beyond Garnett. Mitchell, once a versatile actor, became locked into a single controversial identity. That frustration occasionally surfaced in interviews, which were then used as further evidence of supposed complicity. Only later did reassessment clarify his role. Critics acknowledged the sophistication of the performance and the risks he took. But during the show's original run, Mitchell paid the price for trusting the audience too much. His experience underscores a harsh truth. Hostility doesn't always follow intent. Sometimes it follows impact. And as British entertainment moved toward figures whose reputations were shaped less by characters and more by cultural misunderstanding, the final names on this list would reveal how easily public discomfort becomes personal judgment, and how rarely it waits for context. 16. Frankie Howerd. Frankie Howerd made Britain laugh while simultaneously making it uncomfortable, which is a risky bargain in a culture that prefers its comedy either reassuring or righteous. His style was unmistakable. Exaggerated pauses, conspiratorial glances, innuendo wrapped in mock innocence. For a while it felt daring. Then, for many critics and commentators, it began to feel exhausting. The hostility toward Howerd wasn't fueled by scandal or cruelty, but by repetition and timing. As social attitudes shifted through the 1960s and 1970s, his comedy became an easy target for moral campaigners and reviewers eager to signal progress. What once seemed cheeky was now labeled smutty. What once passed as subversive was dismissed as lazy. Howerd became shorthand for a kind of humor that critics wanted to bury so something cleaner, sharper, and more self-consciously modern could take its place. Reviews grew harsher. Television executives grew cautious. The BBC, in particular, struggled with him, caught between his undeniable popularity and the persistent complaints that followed each broadcast. Howerd was rarely accused of intent. Instead, he was accused of tone. His comedy, critics argued, encouraged snickering rather than thought, indulgence rather than insight. What complicated the hostility was the disconnect between the performer and the person. Off-screen, Howerd was anxious, self-critical, and deeply insecure. He feared irrelevance even as audiences continued to laugh. That fear leaked into performances, sometimes sharpening them, sometimes hollowing them out. To critics, he seemed stuck. To fans, he seemed reliable. British culture often punishes reliability when it starts to look like resistance to change. Unlike others on this list, Howerd never fully lost public affection. The hostility hovered mostly at the level of commentary rather than outright rejection. He was scolded, not exiled. But the scolding was constant enough to shape his later career, narrowing opportunities and reinforcing the idea that he belonged to an older, less respectable era of entertainment. In retrospect, the critiques reveal as much about the critics as they do about Howerd. Comedy that refuses to evolve is easy to condemn. Comedy that evolves in the wrong direction is even easier. Howerd stood awkwardly between those judgments, absorbing disdain while still filling seats. And as Britain continued redefining what it wanted its stars to represent, morally, politically, aesthetically, the final figure on this list would face a quieter but no less decisive form of rejection, driven not by controversy, but by changing taste and the unforgiving speed of cultural turnover. 17. Anna Neagle. Anna Neagle was never loudly disliked. Her fall from favor was more subtle, more British, and perhaps more final. She represented something the country no longer wanted to see: reassurance without irony, virtue without tension, patriotism without embarrassment. And when taste shifted, she was left standing alone in the old light. During her peak, Neagle embodied national steadiness. Her performances in wartime and post-war cinema offered comfort, dignity, and emotional clarity. Audiences trusted her. Institutions embraced her. She became, in effect, a symbol rather than a star. And symbols age faster than people. As post-war Britain moved into skepticism and cultural restlessness, Neagle's image hardened into something critics quietly resented. She was framed as establishment-approved, safe, overly wholesome. Younger reviewers dismissed her work as sentimental. Filmmakers chasing realism and grit had no use for her style. The hostility wasn't cruel, but it was firm. She was no longer relevant. What made this rejection particularly stark was its lack of scandal. Neagle didn't misbehave. She didn't provoke. She didn't cling publicly. She simply continued to represent values that no longer felt fashionable. British culture, often impatient with earnestness, responded by looking away. Critics revisited her films with condescension, praising craftsmanship while questioning purpose. She became associated with propaganda rather than performance, her sincerity reframed as naivety. That reframing stuck, influencing how her work was taught, discussed, and programmed. Neagle herself seemed aware of the shift. She stepped back rather than fight it, which preserved her dignity but accelerated her disappearance. Absence, in this case, was mistaken for irrelevance. The hostility was not shouted, it was institutionalized through omission. Only later did reassessment restore her standing, recognizing the skill beneath the symbolism and the cultural need her performances once fulfilled. But during the transition, she was quietly sidelined, a reminder that dislike doesn't always arrive with outrage. Sometimes it arrives as silence. Anna Neagle closes this list not because she was hated in the loud sense, but because her experience reveals a final, uncomfortable truth. In British culture, the most enduring hostility is often reserved not for those who offend, but for those who no longer fit the story a nation wants to tell about itself.